Welcome to the module on administering Azure virtual machines. In this session, we will cover essential aspects of planning and managing Azure virtual machines and configuring virtual machine availability. Additionally, we will touch on determining virtual machine sizing, storage, and also configuring secure access and networking. By the end of this module, you will have a better understanding of how to administer Azure virtual machines effectively and efficiently. So let's get started. Now, just before we go into the details of virtual machines, let's have a quick conversation around what are different cloud responsibilities. Now, if we have a quick conversation around resources that are typically based on your prem environment, then typically all the responsibilities lie with you. You manage all the hardware, you're looking at all the networking, you're looking at configuring all sorts of different details on top of that, such as operating systems, the patches, the updates, looking at access to your resources. So the responsibilities completely lie with you. However, as you start moving into the cloud and utilizing cloud services and solutions, you might be looking at one of the solutions called IaaS, or Infrastructure as a Service. Now, infrastructure as a service means that you are looking to bring your solution into an environment or with the cloud service provider, in our case, to Azure, where we don't need to necessarily worry about all the hardware side of things that live under the hood for us for creating a solution. And in this case, don't have to worry about the hardware, the electrical power, the networking, the backup, the cooling of that hardware. It's all something that we'll leave onto Azure or the Microsoft to manage for us, depending on where we plan to run our solutions. Now, using IaaS, we are simply giving that part for our service provider to manage, and we are going to bring our own solution on top of that. Typically, you will look into managing your own operating system for a solution. And this is where you can start seeing if you were looking at creating a virtual machine environment, you're not worried about all the hardware that it needs to support your virtual machine. However, you will start creating your own operating system on that virtual machine, which could be a different variety of versions of Windows, could be Linux, depending on what you are planning to run on it. However, you manage and maintain them. You will manage the updates on them, the patching on them, the security updates that are coming around for those resources, anything else that you want to configure on top of that, such as your networking access, your applications that you want to install, the updates on those applications that you're working on. So this is something that will become part of your responsibility all the way up to the data layer. Now, there are quite a few other cloud services that we can choose from. We can switch into looking at a solution that's offered to us as a PaaS or platform as a service. Now, understanding platform as a service, we are provided with a platform where we can bring our own solution and get running or get going with our service. Now, as part of that, there are a couple of different options we can consider. Either we look at a platform where we don't need to worry about all the underlying hardware and operating system as part of that setup. But along with that, depending on the kind of PaaS solution you pick, if, for instance, you bring your own application that you've designed for you to work with in your environment, you're simply plugging that on the platform that's been provided to you. However, you manage and maintain the code and updates to that application. In Azure, there are quite a few solutions offered to you as a PaaS solution. If you're picking one of those solutions, then that part of management is also handed over to Azure. So you're looking at a solution that could have shared responsibilities between you and the service provider that you're working along with. So depending on the type of solution you take. Now, we could talk about a third solution that we can pick from the cloud, which is called SaaS, or in short, as short, SaaS, incomplete, is software as a service. In short, SaaS or SaaS. Now, SaaS services could be simply you're looking at working with solutions like your Office 365 or M365 versions, a suite of tools that you're working in the cloud. Now, bear in mind, you understand this is not you downloading a Office application on your laptop and working with it. However, For example, you log into office.com and in the browser you click on Word and you start using the application. Now that's something that you don't need to worry about in the back-end, the underlying hardware, the operating system, the application versions and additions or updates. You're simply clicking on the application and you're using it, and you're simply managing the access to that resource, and that's pretty much it. Everything else is managed for you in that scenario. Now let's go back into the couple of options that we just spoke about. Let's take an example. For instance, I could look at a scenario where I can simply start working with a virtual machine environment and start creating a virtual machine. Now, on a virtual machine, which is an IaaS solution, typically I'm not worried about the underlying hardware. In this case, I get to choose what I want and configure it. On top of that, I'll bring in my own operating system. Again, this is something I can choose to pick an image from Azure or bring my own. On top of that, I can then bring in my own applications that I might want to work with. So I define what solution I want to bring in that scenario. Now, this could be anything. In fact, on top of my operating system, I might decide to say, you know what, this is going to be my solution for SQL. So we'll bring in a solution, or in this case, an SQL database on my virtual machine. However, Azure has another solution completely different to this, offered in the cloud, which is called Azure SQL. Now, there are a few different flavors of that, so I'm not going into details of Azure SQL today. However, just as a quick example, this is a PaaS solution. That means I don't have to actually worry about anything that is happening under the hood on this solution, because it's a PaaS offering. I don't need to worry about the operating system that's working underneath. I do get to choose the server that I might need to configure as part of the service. However, I don't have access to it. I don't need to worry about the updates to it. I don't need to worry about the updates to SQL, and I can simply use that service. So it depends on the type of responsibility and management that you need in a solution. You get to choose what type of service that's available to you and what type of service you want to configure. Now, one thing that's important to bear in mind before we go any further into virtual machines a little bit more, the difference between the two of these solutions would be a little bit like this. If, for instance, I am looking at a SQL solution that I don't have a particular constraint with, for example, I don't have a legacy application that only works with a particular operating system and a particular edition and version of SQL, then in that case, Azure SQL might do the trick for me. Again, like I said, there are a few flavors that we can look some details into that. However, typically, if you are limited with some of those options, then your solution looking at or working with a virtual machine might be an easier way around that. For instance, I can install my own version edition of operating system. I can bring an edition and version of an SQL that works, supports my current environment if I couldn't find a solution in the cloud for it. So again, depending on sometimes what type of solution you have, you might be limited in what you can do. However, we can always explore new possibilities now moving to the cloud. Now let's have a quick discussion around how we start to plan and create virtual machines. Now, for us to do this, a few things that we have to recall from some of the previous sessions that we've worked on. One of the sessions that we have covered already in the past is looking at virtual machines. One of the key aspects for virtual machines, virtual networks, was to make sure that we understand that we need to plan a virtual network before we create it. Now, the creation doesn't take too long. Similarly, for our virtual machines today, creating a virtual machine in the cloud doesn't take too long. However, there are quite a few things that we can consider when we are creating a virtual machine, depending on our needs and the requirements that we have to comply with. Now, first of all, as you can see on the screen as well, we can start looking at the network settings in the backend. Now, a virtual machine is going to be based within a virtual network environment. It would have a network interface card that would need to have some sort of connectivity. So it needs to be placed in a virtual network. So you need to plan. Do I have a virtual network? What location is it in? is it got enough IP addresses, the IP address the schemes on IP addressing that we have had discussed in the past. So all those planning comes into play at this stage. Now, along with that, you'll get to choose a name for your virtual machine. Now, typically you could start with calling it VM1. However, is that a good name if you're looking to manage about 500 or more virtual machines, or even 50 virtual machines? Maybe not. So maybe a better naming convention would be a nice way to work within your environment. Then comes the basic setup that we typically talk about is choosing your location. Now, this becomes very, very important, as we mentioned before, when we're looking at the core components of your architectural components of Azure. We mentioned that location or regions are important, simply because sometimes there are certain solutions that are only available in certain regions. Certain availability features are only available in regions that can offer availability, along with different types of resources. Now, in case of virtual machines, we can look at different features that can only be available in certain regions. That can make a lot of difference in type of solution you're after, along with the cost, running cost of a solution in different regions. So you need to start considering the prices of some of these solutions that you are going to implement in your environment in terms of creating the same type of virtual machine in one region as compared to creating the same resource in a different region. However, you can never forget about compliance. So if I have some sort of limitation or restriction about where in terms of regions can I create that, and if I'm complying with certain laws, legislations, or local standards, then in that case, I might have to consider looking at placing this resource in a region where I can be compliant. So price might be more expensive. However, that might be a requirement for me in that environment. Now, if you don't have that constraint, or a resource that you're creating doesn't actually breaches any of those issues, then in that case, you might want to choose a resource that's cheaper that you can utilize, or taking it to a region that's more closer to your end users who are going to be accessing this resource. So again, part of the planning, some of the things that you will consider. Now, along with this, we want to talk about some more things. Things like, what compute do I start bringing into my machine? What do I want to work with as in terms of what is a workload that I'm creating in the cloud? This virtual machine is going to be doing certain tasks. Do I now need a resource that can be compute heavy? It requires more processing? Does it require more memory in the backend to process information? Does it need a graphic card better than a normal machine? Or do I need to now start looking for a resource that has higher storage space or can allow multiple additional disks to be added onto it? Now, there is a series of different compute resources that you can pick from within Azure. We'll have a quick look at some of these a bit later on. However, we can start looking at different series like A, B, D, or DC to look at some general version of compute that you can pick from. Then there are some specific versions. Things like compute optimized, you might be looking at something with an F or FX series. If you're looking at something to do with memory optimized, you're looking at E or M series. Similarly, if you're looking for graphic card optimized, you're looking for N series. And if you're looking for something to do with storage, you might be looking at an L series. Now, there's a long list of these, and you can always find documentation that can explain even further in detail, because each one of these series will have, again, sub solutions within them to pick from. So there's a long list of them. You decide what works for you best and the reason for you to create a resource. Now, at times, I might be looking for a cheaper solution to work with. However, if that cheapest solution is going to take me 3 days to come up to the conclusion of my initial task, what if I created a much faster, much more expensive resource and completed that task in 3 or 4 hours? Then again, you can weigh out the cost and the time it takes to create things. Again, with cloud first mentality, we can always create resources. Once we're done with them, we can get rid of them. And we can always look for something that can do a task much quicker and also be cost effective at the same time. Now, apart from looking at the compute in the back end, the virtual machines has a second part for us to consider. In this case, we are looking at a storage. Now, just to kind of break some of this down, if I was to kind of very quickly scribble some stuff on the screen right here. So imagine if I was to say, this is my virtual machine. I can simply say I have a part that was compute that we just spoke about in terms of considering all sorts of different things like the CPU, the memory, the storage ability, the IOPS, and all sorts of different things. The second part that we can look at over here is the storage part. Now, bearing in mind that we need to start bringing in some sort of data as part of this virtual machine. To begin with, the operating system that we are going to install for this virtual machine needs some sort of space to live and run. Along with that, if we need to bring in some data to this, we might need to start planning on where this data goes. Are we creating this as part of the disk that we have for the operating system? Do we need to add additional disks? And all sorts of different things that we might need to consider based on our need. A few things to bear in mind here. Two different things that you might need to consider when you're creating a virtual machine: compute and storage. Now, with storage, we have a few options to pick from. The disks that you attach for your storage solutions within your virtual machines can be one of the following. We can choose a standard disk for our virtual machine. That means we can, in the back end, have a hard disk or hard disk drive or an SSD or solid state drive as an option for you to pick from. Obviously, you don't have the direct access to it in terms of physical access, but it's something that is allocated to you on the back end from one of the regions in the data centers that you are choosing to plug this virtual machine to. Or you can go with choosing a premium solution and going into saying, hey, I'll use a premium SSD. Now, there is an advantage apart from getting a better IOPS to this resource, which might be able to handle low latency and higher input output per second. You also get along with this an SLA for 99.9%. Well, maybe I just dropped that point in the wrong position. So let's do 9%, 99.9% SLA as part of creating a virtual machine with a premium disk. The premium disk or SSDs would come with a 99.9% uptime or availability to this. Now, along with that, a couple other things to bear in mind. Typically, when you're looking at a machine, consider your laptop, consider your desktop, your office machine that you're working with. Whenever you install a Windows operating system, by default, you'll always see that operating system going into, by default, a C drive. Default settings. Again, if you're configuring them slightly different, that's something completely away from this conversation. But as a default setting, if you take that, C drive is typically your operating system drive. Now, your Azure virtual machines do the same as, and when you create a disk and attach it to your virtual machine and you start configuring it with an operating system of your choice, it will automatically consider the operating system disk to be the C drive. However, as a result of your compute choice, typically, in most cases, you will also see a second disk automatically appearing up on your virtual machines, which you don't have to configure unless you have chosen a compute that doesn't cater for this. However, there are a few options to explore on that. Typically, most of your virtual machines compute that you choose will come with a temporary disk. Now, typically this temporary disk will be placed by default as a D drive, so bear this in mind. Simply because the temporary disk does not retain data, so it as and when you shut down this machine or is deallocated, when you bring it back, any data that you had within it would not be retained. So please ensure that you do not keep any data in the D drive that you expect to have access to at a later stage. So please ensure that you don't start utilizing the D drive for anything. The system requires us to create the temporary disk space. In your normal machine environment, you'll have a temporary folder in your C drive, you'll have a temporary folder created under your apps, and you have quite a few different spaces for temp disks or temp data. In your virtual machines, typically your system will create a temporary drive, which will be a D drive, and it will store data into it. Now, please don't start creating solutions with things onto D drive. Speaking to quite a few people in the past, I've come across scenarios where people have ran scripts and created resources without realizing this particular option, and they ended up building solutions into D drive and running their resources, and then finding out that if they did turn the machines down, they will lose all of that stuff that they've created and they have to recreate it again. Now that's something that you might be able to get away with. You do have an option now to go and change the drive letter for your temporary disk if you don't want it to be D and you want to use D for something else. But we'll leave that out of the conversation for today. Now, if you're required to add any additional disks for data, for any other use, maybe you're running RAID on your machines or anything else that you want to run as part of your setup, and you require additional disks, by all means you can do that, and you can choose a drive letter that suits you best, and you can start adding additional disks. Now, the limitation of number of disks that you can add will then again come back from the compute that you choose in your environment. Different compute sizes will limit you on the maximum number of disks they can support. So if you have a requirement, plan well. Go and have a look at some of the details around the compute sizes you have. How many do they offer? How many disks can I add to it? What type of memory? What type of CPU can I have into that? So all of that stuff is something that you might need to look into managing. Now, one thing that's very important to look at this is here talking about the virtual machine disks that we have in the backend. These are managed for you by Azure. You cannot go into these disks and start doing things to it. These are managed automatically. So when I create my virtual machine, I'll get to choose what I need. However, they're not something that I need to go and create in my storage account or choose a page blob somewhere and create one in there. I don't need to do any of that. It is automatically created for me and it's automatically managed. I don't need to go into that and find what storage account it lives under or how it looks like. It's something that Azure will completely manage that for me. Now, let's have a quick look at creating some virtual machines in our portal. So just going back into the portal now, looking at creating a virtual machine for this session. So what we will do is start with clicking on virtual machines. Now I'll ignore some of the virtual machines I've already got running. We'll click on a new one and we'll go through the whole setup of creating a new virtual machine in Azure environment. Now, let me zoom out just a tad bit so we can see some more onto the screen and start looking at some details. Now, this is a nice feature that pops up onto the screen that gives me an estimated monthly cost of running my machine. In the past, you had to go into tools like Azure Cost Calculator for me to understand running or an estimated cost of me creating a resource. Now, this gives me a rough guidance on roughly how much it will cost. Now let's go through some of this. The first thing, we are on the basic tab today, again, as usual, as we've done many times in the course. If you haven't been part of any of the videos, please watch the previous videos to understand how to create resources. We discussed the basic tabs in module 2, and since then we've been talking about it. Basic details, subscription. Try to map this onto a resource group that we are working on in this particular course, and coming down to naming your resource or this particular virtual machine with a name. Now let's come up with a app server. I believe I might have one already in my setup called app server. Just to make sure this is not the same one, let's give it app server 3 as a name. So maybe I should have checked, but so since I haven't, let's call it app server 3 as a name. Now, let's go through some more details into this. Region we are choosing. Currently, I'm going to leave my region to UK South, and we'll come back to some more details around the virtual networks because we've created virtual networks in early modules. I am going to place this into one of my existing virtual networks. I don't have to, but we'll see how both of those options look like in a few moments. Now, further down, I have an option called availability. Now, I'll leave availability options out right now. We'll come back to this. We'll circle back onto this option a bit later on. This is the next part of this this module where we discuss availability and also look into scalability as a solution. Now we'll come back to some of this. For now, let's turn it off and say none. We'll explore the other options a bit later on. Now, as I move along, I have some other options to consider. Now, I have security type. I have a few different options here to consider to create my resources. Now, with current settings that I have in the region that I'm creating, I can only look at creating standard or trusted launch virtual machines. Now, the difference between the two you would see is with the trusted launch virtual machine, it gives you an added threat protection onto your machines, making sure that they can be defended better in terms of any malicious activity against it. Things like secure boot or anything that typically you see as an attack to do with boot kits or root kits that you can see happening onto operating systems. Now, the trusted launch virtual machine will defend your resources from that. So if you're worried about a resource that could be targeted with similar types of attacks, maybe you might want to consider creating a resource that is a bit more secure, including as trusted launch virtual machines will be. Now, this includes the virtual trusted platform module over here. Now, the TPMs typically is something that you will see as a hardware option on your motherboards that could help you with storing some of your encryption keys and security keys. Now, similar to that, you can have this feature available in your virtual machines as well. So if you're looking for a solution that can manage any of those keys in your environment, then this particular solution would help you with ensuring that your data that's again kept on the virtual machine isn't tampered with, because it will have a virtual trusted platform module available for this machine that is apart from the actual machine or the virtual machine itself. So again, making it a bit more secure for you to create a resource under a trusted launch virtual machine. Now, if you're not looking at a secure version of machine, by all means, the standard version would be good enough. It does come with some security options that you can configure. Again, comes down to the workload that you're implementing, and if you require some additional security, highly recommend moving on to the trusted launch virtual machine as an option. You do, however, have another option, that's to look at confidential virtual machine, which in my case is grayed out on my demo environment. However, this gives you a completely isolated hardware environment in the back end, so you can create your own virtual machines to give you that additional layer of security for your resources. Now, let's move on with the trusted launch virtual machine in this case. As I do that, I can see I have options to choose an image. This is where I can decide what operating system I need for my virtual machine. Currently it's showing me Ubuntu. Now I can choose to move away from that to Windows operating systems. You can see some of my recent uses or used operating systems: 10, Windows 11, and Server 2022. However, I'm not just limited with these. I can click on See All Images, and this is where it will take me into looking at quite a few different images that are available on the marketplace. Now, if I was to quick check on this, there are about 13,000 results that are available for me to pick from within this environment. Now, there are loads of different options I can look at, different editions, some with built-in solutions in here. So you might want to go scrolling down into finding out if there is one that already has maybe a database or an application or a solution that you're after already available for you to pick from. Now, if you find one, by all means, please pick and choose and work with it. If you don't find one, by all means, you can bring it in your own image in this stage. Now, I won't perform that as part of this demo today. However, once you have an image, for instance, on-prem, you have a server running with all the settings and details going onto them, you could do what we refer as a lift and shift. And when you do the lift and shift, you're kind of taking the image of that running setup and you're simply bringing the exact same running setup in your environment in the cloud, and you're rebuilding a virtual machine with the same image. Now, if that's something that you're looking into, you could easily perform that. All you'll have to do is create an image library in Azure, and once you place those images in there, they'll be visible for you under this option which says My Images, and you should be able to pick them from in here. Now, in my part of the demo today, I don't have any images available for me here. However, if this is something that you use all the time in your environment, maybe you have golden images for your HR department and a golden image for your IT department, or whatever the need that you may have, you can use your own images if you don't want to start from scratch, picking up from one of the operating systems that are there available for you. Now, let's go back a step. Let's carry on doing this with one of the standard images that we have. In this case, let's go and choose a Windows 11 image, and we'll work with that. Now, as I move along, it gives me the architecture for this. Currently, I'm going to carry on with x64 version of things. And if I look further down, there are loads of different options that we can explore, but I'll try to limit some of these options in our conversation for this particular course. There is another option here talking about the spot instance. Now, typically, if you're looking at creating a resource at a cheaper cost, a resource that you don't necessarily need or need to rely on for longer periods of time, you may want to choose this option. Please explore this in your own time. However, please bear in mind this is only going to be cheap for you to run, simply because if and when the region that you're choosing to create this in requires to take back some of the hardware or the compute that you are implementing as part of running this, they might be able to do that. And you choose over here, either they stop and deallocate that for you, or they delete that resource and take some of those resources away as and when the need increases. So there's that worry. Now, if you don't have that problem of losing that resource as and when your Azure requires to take that away from you, then in that case, explore some of these options. You can pick and choose some of the cheaper versions of running these this particular virtual machine solution under a spot discount, but we'll come out of that. We'll leave that alone for today. All right, now, hopefully that was quite a few things already, and we haven't gone past the basic tab yet. Let's have a quick look at the next step that we are choosing. Like I said, planning is a key on the virtual machines. If you're not planning well, this is where you'll be taking far too long in deciding what to do. Yet again, if you know exactly what you're picking from, you could simply go and choose the options you want, and you should be able to create this virtual machine within less than a few seconds, and it should be ready for you in, again, a few seconds for you to utilize. Now, let's talk about the sizes one more time. Like I said, I can pick and choose some sizes. It's showing me some recommended and some recently used ones, or we can simply click in here and say, show me all the sizes that I can work with. Now, please bear with me, the demo environment that I am in, I have some additional constraint to see certain sizes. However, in your environment, under your subscriptions, you might see some more options available to you. So please explore them in the documentation or within your subscriptions to see all the options available. Now, like I said earlier on, you can start looking at options with B series, D series, DC series. These are more generic series or general purpose series that you can pick from. Now, each one of them, for instance, let's go into B series. If I go into some of the details on this, there's quite a few options there. There's again a few available for me to pick from. What you can look at under here is this: CPUs. What do I need? How much power do I need from my CPU, or virtual CPU in this case? How much memory do I need for it to work, or what resource I need, or what application I'm running which would require more or less memory into it. Then we can look at number of disks. If I don't draw multiple boxes, looking at number of disks that might be required. Like I said, if you need more than 2 disks, you might need to look at a different option. Maximum IOPS. Then you can look at some other options. If I scroll across, you can see you can have a local storage. You can look at premium disk support. And then moving on to my right, I can see the rough cost of running some of these as I choose these solutions. And when we come back out, we'll see an overall cost as it's running across, or the estimated overall cost for running that solution. Now, again, like I said, we have some other options. We have D series in here. Let's minimize this D series. Again, there's a long list of these options available for us to explore. We have, again, an E series that's to do with high memory needs. We can look at compute workload with F series. We have, again, for memory, we have L series if you're looking for a low latency as part of your memory. And we do have some others that, like I said, I don't currently have availability to use in my subscription, and we can pick up things. These are some of the regional limits. We can pick up things that are things like virtual machines that are supported with NVIDIA graphic card as part of that. So if I try N series, you can see size not available for me. Now, some of these N series come with a graphic card available for me. So they all have GPUs in them, and you can read more about them to understand exactly what type of a graphic card they have and how powerful those graphic cards are. And then you can also see what CPUs are, again, working or number of virtual CPUs that it can cater for. So you can, again, explore some of them. By all means, don't forget to look at the prices on some of these. As I said, depending on the type of compute you add, your costs on the resource can keep on going higher and higher. For example, this particular one could cost me about $43,800 to run for a month, a roughly cost on that resource type. So again, this is something I don't have availability to work with in my demo environments, but as an option, someone could choose this in typical normal subscription. This should be available for you to use. Now I'll come back out of the sizes for now. Let's choose one of the general sizes that I have already allocated to me. I'll carry on working with that. Simple 2 virtual CPU cores and 8 gig RAM is okay for me in this demo, so I'll work with that. Now, along with that, if I scroll down, I see that there are some other details I need to create. Now, this is very, very important to understand when you're working with your resources in Azure environment, typically your virtual machines. You need to assign username and passwords to this. This is going to be your administrator password or administrator password for that machine, typically like you do on your laptops or devices that you work with. That's your local admin password. So you need to create one. Now, before I go into creating this, what I'm going to do is just for a second, switch this to Ubuntu. So looking at a Linux solution to understand exactly what options do I get within that. Now, one thing that changes for my Linux environment is this. I get options to say, hey, do you want to log into Linux using a public key, SSH key to log in? Now, if I was to create that, I can simply go and create a key to log into that. So again, I'll need to ensure that I understand that I need to manage that key if I'm keeping it. Earlier on previous sessions, I've mentioned things like Azure Key Vault will be a nice place to keep them, just because if you lose access to these keys, you'll lose access to these resources. So it's very, very important to understand that. Now, if I was to choose the password version, we can do that on Linux devices as well. So you have 2 different options in terms of managing that on your Linux machine. However, for this demo, let's carry on working with creating a Windows 11 resource in this case. And again, we're asked to type in some details. So let's create this as a solution. Let's type in some details in here. Let's create my account as Azure user and type in a password. Now, this is not necessarily a very nice username to use. A very commonly targeted username. The usernames are very, very important for resources to use. I am just using this for a demo purpose. Please don't use this. Try to keep your administrator account name unique. Time and time again, when we see different reports on security, and typically when people are trying to do initial access attacks, they are trying various different types of username and passwords for them to gain access into your virtual machines if they're exposed. A common name they'll use is administrator, user, Azure user, user one, and some basic names that we typically use on our devices on-prem or personal use. So please come up with a better naming convention than just Azure user. All right, as I was doing, please don't do what I'm doing, but hear into what I'm saying. Please don't keep Azure user as your username. Let's create a password for this machine. And again, once I'm happy with the password, we'll try typing that in again twice just to make sure I've got that right. Once I've got in, the right passwords in there, I have an option here to define my incoming ports to this resource. Now, if you've seen the virtual networking sessions, you'll understand that typically you will need to have some sort of rules defined on accessing your resources on your virtual networks, particularly if you're looking at managing NSGs. Now, in this case, what I am going to say is I'm going to say no to this, because we are going to manage this later, as it suggests that we could look into configuring this on the tab further up, which is under networking. So we'll look at this under networking page in a few moments. Finally, I can go and click on this box over here to confirm I do have a license for Windows 10 and Windows 11, and I am going to be using this. Now, this is where you can take the benefit of any licensing options you have, either a hybrid benefits option, if you may, on your prem that qualifies for something similar for your virtual machines. You can reuse those licenses in the cloud, or if you have a license that can cater for multiple tenants, then in that case you can use that benefit here and reduce the cost on your resource. Otherwise, typically adding a license comes as an added cost to your virtual machine. So if you already have a license, you can save that cost in this environment. All right, now let's talk about some other details. Let's jump onto the next tab. We are looking at the second tab now, looking at disks. We spoke about some basic details around the disks earlier on, and I mentioned we can choose different types of disks. Currently, it's picking up a disk with a space of 127 GB. I'm going to keep that. I'm not changing this at the moment. I have other options with a maximum going up to 2 terabyte, so I can pick that up as well if I needed for any reason that space for my virtual machine. But I'll leave mine as 127 gigabytes at this point. Now, looking down, if I see the other options over here, I have options to pick from standard disks to standard SSDs. Again, it tells you the workload type you might be using. Non-critical, if I'm going into a lightly used enterprise application or something in production with better performance and sensitive workload, then maybe a premium SSD because it comes with an SLA added to it. So I'll leave that to a premium SSD. Now, I do have options to place these. I do have options to place these under zone redundant storage solutions. Now let's come back and talk into zonal solutions a bit later on, as we cover the availability a bit later in this module. All right, let's choose the premium SSD and move on with it. Now, I have certain other options selected, like delete this virtual machine. Delete this disk with the virtual machine once it gets deleted. I do this with my demos simply because I want this to reduce my effort into finding the resources I'm done with and getting rid of them after the demo is completed. However, in the real scenarios, when you're working with virtual machines, you might not need to do that. You might require to keep that disk that you can attach to another machine at a later stage. So something that you can plan when you're doing or creating your virtual machines in your environments. Do I need this disk to be retained for other solutions? If you do, don't tick this box because it will delete it as you get rid of the virtual machines in your environment. Right, now as I go along, I have my platform managed keys in this solution. I don't get to see the customer managed keys at this point because of this, some of the options I've chosen in creating this compute. However, if you were, you could create encryption onto your disks and add disk level encryption and bring your own keys if you wanted to manage them. Something that we discussed under the storage accounts as well. So you have some of those options in here. However, I'll leave that out. Now, Ultra Disks is something that I had on the screen earlier on the slide deck. Now, for a moment, let's jump back onto the slide deck for 1 second. Now, as you see my slides, and I have the Ultra Disk, and I went as far as talking about the disks, but I stopped there for a good reason. Now, Ultra Disks are available for us to use depending on the region. They're not available in all the regions, so that's one thing to bear in mind when you're looking at Ultra Disks. So if they are available in the region that you're working in. Bear in mind, these are typically not designed to be used for your OS disks. So typically these are something that we can add as additional disks. So you could be using additional disks to add Ultra disks, typically not designed for you to use as OS disks. So bear some of these details in mind. Now, before I go back and complete my virtual machine configuration, one thing I've mentioned a few times already, once you're done with your virtual machine, you can get rid of it and you don't pay for the resource that you are not using anymore. However, what about if somebody has a virtual machine, but instead of getting rid of it, they simply stop the virtual machine? Now, like I said earlier as well, when you stop some resources, in this scenario, your temporary disk will stop and wipe the data. The data is not retained into that. Now, if you're looking for data retention, use another disk. However, once you stop, resources are deallocated. Now, when your resources are deallocated, typically your compute is deallocated. Your storage is still intact for you in your place. So once you go back and once you go back and start that virtual machine, it will carry on running from where it was in terms of the configuration you had. Now, if that is the case, one thing that comes to mind is by stopping the virtual machine, the cost on that virtual machine doesn't stop, because even though I am losing the compute is deallocated, the storage is still there. So I still get charged for the storage that's going to be running in the backend. So just bear that in mind. If you're not using any of that at all, stopping might still come at a cost. So it's better sometimes to completely get rid of it by simply deleting the virtual machine and then recreating it again, as we mentioned in module 3, talking about templates. Recreate it super quick by simply pushing out a template. Now let's go back into this. So as we were talking about the Ultra disks, let's talk about some other options. Now, further down on the menu, I have options here to suggest to create and attach a new disk to it. So imagine if this compute caters for another 2 disks or another 4 disks or whatever the compute was, we can add other disks to it. We could actually attach an existing disk to it. Now, for example, I create a virtual machine, I delete the virtual machine, but I don't get rid of the disk. Like we had the option earlier to say, don't delete the disk, as we just spoke about it up here. Now, if I don't delete that disk, if I create a new virtual machine, I can attach that disk again to a new virtual machine as an additional disk if I needed to, or manage it the way it suits me best. So I have some of those options to explore as part of my disk, as part of my virtual machine. Now let's move on to the next tab. This next tab is networking. This should be pretty straightforward for us to understand after you've gone through the whole 3 modules on virtual networks. This should be straightforward. However, if you haven't seen those modules yet, please go back and have a quick look into them to understand exact details of what you need to do in terms of planning for a virtual network. Now, we created a few virtual networks already. So what I am going to do is I am going to go and place this resource into one of my virtual networks. So let's go back into VNet A and drop it in there. Now, VNet A already has a subnet called subnet 1 or VNet A subnet 1, and already has an addressing scheme already given to me. Now, if I need to change any of that, all I need to do is click create new, or already plan and create one and come here and choose them. In both scenarios is perfectly fine. Now, if I don't see a subnet that is in here, I could create a new one in here by simply clicking on that and then going back into the networking page and creating a new subnet, coming here and choosing that and moving along. Along with that, I have option here to request for a new public IP address. Now, we spoke about public IP addresses as part of my IP addresses, and we spoke about creating public IP address twice before in the course, once with IP addressing and once with load balancer. So I am currently requesting for a public IP address to be allocated to my resource. So I'll leave that option there. I'm not taking that off. However, not all the virtual machines will require a public IP. So you plan well if you need one. Now, as part of this, if I look into the details of the network security group options to the network interface card at this stage, I can say don't add one. Maybe I'm planning to add one on the subnet and the subnet already has one. Now it tells me something over here. Again, this is nice to see that it already gives me an indication to suggest that the selected subnet that we are working with already is associated to a network security group. So I am okay to live with that setting. However, if you are going with that exceptional situation that we spoke about, where we might need to add a second layer of NSG to the NIC directly and also have one on the subnet, in that case, we can do this here. We can start saying, yes, let's bring a new one. Let's call it a basic one, and we choose from the ports that we want to open. Now, if you know how to configure them, you're simply going to advance a version of this and choose an NSG that you already have created, or create a new one in that case. Now, just for this demo, let's switch that off and leave it as none. Now, one more thing that I am going to do, I am going to tick on this box that suggests delete the IP address network interface card when the virtual machine is deleted. Again, this is for ease of management for me in my demos. However, you might not need to do this in your environment. So that's something that you might want to bear in mind. Again, if you're looking at creating and accelerated networking solutions, this is something we've mentioned before in the course as well, that you might have a need for this depending on what type of solution that you're looking at. There might be sometimes a requirement that you must have the accelerated networking available or enabled before you can create certain solutions. So this could be an option that you might need to come back and tick on. Now, if this virtual machine is going as part of my load balancer solution, which we did create in the previous modules, I could simply plug this in here. So increasing the pool of the backend pool of my load balancer. And in this case, if I say, yes, it is a load balancer or application gateway, and I can go and choose into the load balancer that we created in one of the previous modules, and I can add this into the backend pool. As you can see, some of the settings popping up from my resources. Now, not all backend IP address reference. Okay, cool. An error that we don't need to worry about, because I'm not actually going to do this. I'm just showing you the options that you can explore as part of that. Now, in the management tab, there are quite a few things that we can look at. Things like we have already got a security feature enabled in my subscription, which we'll leave out for this part of the session. However, if I look further down, I have options to look at managing my access to my resource or this virtual machine using Entra. Now, this becomes very interesting. So earlier we created admin password for this machine. Now, do I want to give everyone that username and password for them to be able to access this? Not necessarily a very secure thing to do, but to overcome that, you can enable Entra login to this virtual machine. However, when you do that, you might need to assign an identity to this machine, so it can then authenticate to Entra, or the users authenticating against this can use that as part of that setup. One more thing that you will need to do is go back and look at RBAC roles. Now, we spoke about something similar when we were looking at the previous modules in storage and configuring access using Entra. So roles that you might need to assign users who are going to gain access to your resource. Now, in this case, we have virtual machine administrator login role. That would be someone working on this virtual machine as an administrator, or you could look at a role that's a virtual machine continued on the next line to go in virtual machine user login. Now, this would be a standard user login into that machine. Now, just to show you, click on that box, it automatically assigns an identity to it. This particular case, we don't need to do any other configuration, but it would work that way. But for now, let's take it off. There are a couple of other features that we have under in this part of the session, talking about auto shutdown, backup, site recovery, but we'll leave them out for today's conversation. Again, you might want to explore that. However, we don't have an auto start at the moment. You can create a script for it, or simply go into the portal and click the start button. Under the monitoring tab, we have some options to configure monitoring if we want to capture data from this resource, apart from the basic data that Azure portal captures anyway, things like what's going on with the boot or the guest operating system that's running in this virtual machine. Then I can enable some of these here, but we'll leave this out for the last module where we do monitoring. Apart from that, under advanced, we have options to go and trigger some extensions, or a virtual machine application details could be added in here, things that you might be interested to do post-deployment of this virtual machine for Azure to complete for you. So as and when the virtual machine is ready, it will carry out some other setups for you. So you can go into looking at that, but we'll ignore that for today as well. Now let's go ahead to create and review. That's pretty much all the menus that we wanted to cover in terms of creating this virtual machine. When the system has passed and verified, validated these settings for me, I can verify all the details by going through it to make sure I've got the right details in place before I hit the create button. And once I'm ready with this, I can start creating this virtual machine. Now this shouldn't take too long for it to come back, and once my virtual machine is up and running, we'll have a quick look into making sure everything is fine, and then we'll talk a little bit more around in connectivity for this machine. All right, seems like the virtual machine is now created, so let's go into the resource type to have a quick look. So we have our app server 3 ready to go. Currently doing some configurations in the backend, as it says the agent's not ready yet to work, but seems like the machine is up and running and is ready to go. We've got the machine all good and ready. Now this brings us to the end of this part of this session. In the next part of the session, we'll talk about how do we actually connect to this machine and what are the options for me to look at in terms of availability and scalability. Thank you for watching.